Hello, I'm Bruce Zimmerman, and this is the Open Line Garden Show podcast for this week. Now, reflowering plants, there are all different kinds of plants that we can have in our garden that we're going to bring in for the winter and need to restart again for next year. This is a very economical way of gardening because what it does is saves the plants. And so you're not laying that money out each year, but it means that you need to be able to do the work and at the same time provide the conditions. So in some cases you can, in some cases it's just not worth your while. So here's a few that I think you should try. And the first one is tuberous begonias. Now, with the tuberous begonias, they produce a tuber, and it's round and it's usually dish-shaped. Now, you want to make sure that there's no water in that dish. That's one of the easiest things and the biggest mistakes you make. So you've got these growing outdoors in your garden. They're doing wonderful. But in the fall, when the frost comes, I've always found that by the time a hard frost comes to kill the top, that the bulb gets a little frozen too because it's, of course, very shallow rooted. So what I do is I wait till they start to look a little off color before a hard frost. In this area, it's usually sometime around the end of September. And then I lift the plant. I remove most of the top foliage and the roots and the soil. Now, it's important that we remove the soil as well, but be very gentle. It's a very fibrous root system, so it's easy enough to use a gloved hand to remove most of it quite easily, cleanly. And we then want to go and to gather these up and put them in separate boxes. Now, the reason for that is you want to know which one is which color. And believe it or not, I have on occasion mixed them up. The difference between the scarlet ones and the red ones was the problem. I mean, they were close anyways. Most people never even noticed. A few neighbors, since I was planting them in the same spot each year, but I wasn't always saving them, sometimes I decide to change colors, was wondering how these perennial bulbs were coming up and changing color from one year to the next. True story. But in any case, this is what will happen. You've got them all trimmed up, and once they start to dry up a little bit, that top little piece that you've left will actually go and dry up, and you'll be able to remove a bit more. Okay, you then still wish that little bit of an opening that is created in the dish where the stems have come up to dry up a little bit. You're then going to store them in, obviously, a frost-free area that you will find that the temperature should be at about 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and you store them in vermiculite or perlite. Now, this is going to keep them quite dry. You're not adding water to that. You're just storing them in there at those temperatures. And you'll leave them there over winter. Now, when you go to restart them in the spring, you're going to repot them in fresh soil. And usually each one of these tubers are going into about a 4-inch pot. In some of the older ones that get bigger and bigger, of course, you may have to go to a 6. But you'll find usually a 4-inch pot does very well. This means you usually don't overwater as well. But you have to make sure that when you are watering that you do not flood them and get water in that cup again, right? So because you're just going to be pushing them well into the top of the soil surface, about halfway down. If there's a low dip on the cup side somewhere, I always sort of tilt them a little bit so that that low side is a little higher, and so that there's less likelihood of the water getting in. And then once you've got that going, you're going to go and get them started. Now, you usually want to do them sometime within about a month of before they're going out. Now, in some cases where people are not got the greatest of conditions, you want to go and you want to start them a little earlier. But I don't want you to start them too early unless you have good light, because they'll stretch out, being begonias, and tall begonias are easier to break the stems off when you're doing your transplanting and your planting, etc., and you'll find that you're really lost the battle. It'll take forever for them to recover. You can go and do this. I have some people who are successful at this 2 months in advance, but I would recommend somewhere between 6 weeks and a month. Once they're outside, they will not take frost, so you're waiting till the frost-free days. One thing, begonias usually we put into a little bit of a shady area, and that soil is usually colder, particularly if it's slightly heavier, because they do require rich, organic, well-drained soil. You're going to improve it, but it can be cold. And if it's cold, the plant may not exactly die, but it may just sit there and not do anything. And that sort of stalls them. And even though they get warmed up eventually, then it really has set them back a little bit. So don't rush the ground planting outside, particularly if the soil is cold. If you're having a very wet spring, same thing. Now, there are other things that we get in the wintertime, and that is force bulbs. You can reflower force bulbs if you wish. But what you'll find is once the bulbs have been forced, they've got all their energy used up. They're done. So crocus, hyacinths, narcissus, tulips. Tulips is questionable. We'll get to that. Crocus, hyacinths, and narcissus or daffodils, I like to do these ones. And what you do is you basically, once they finish blooming, you get them into a window where it's cool. Keep them just moist, because remember, we're dealing with a bulb. You might be able to give them a little bit of a plant food, and you get them growing and keep them growing. And you don't let them get frosted. You don't let them get out. You do harden them off a little bit. And then you go and you plant these out in a non-area, like a recovery garden, etc. Out of sight, out of mind. And you replant them out there in rows. Make sure the rows are marked as to color and varieties, etc. And you let them stay there. And you'll feed them and you'll water them. And in the first or second year, once you've decided where they're going to go in the garden, you can lift them in the fall and plant them, and they should bloom the following spring. This usually takes 1 to 2 years for most bulbs. What you'll find is that if you do this, you can also go and plant them directly where they're going to go eventually, as long as you're patient and you don't mind waiting the 2 years to get blooms there. It works, and that's the way I do it. So, but tulips, I always find it's not worth it. Tulips are not that expensive, that once they're all used up, they do recover, but they have a tendency to start to multiply. And when they multiply, then the size of the actual tulip blossom is actually quite small, and therefore it's not worth the work. I usually compost those. Caladiums are an interesting one. People are starting to use caladiums more and more into shaded gardens, outdoors, maybe under trees where water is available. They're not placed out there where there's going to be wet, but the caladium tubers are going to overwinter. In the fall, you start to reduce any moisture that they're getting so that the foliage starts to die down. And then If they are in pots or whatever, you can lift them, but you want all that soil to get as dry as possible. Then if they're in pots, then you remove them from the pot. If they're in the ground, make sure that you remove all the soil and the dead tops, and you store them in dry perlite or vermiculite at 50 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit during the winter. So that's it. Now, in the spring, you repot them with the bud side up. Raise the temperature up as high as you can go, as high as 80 degrees Fahrenheit if you can do it. Once you've done this, remember the soil is going to be moist, organic, and well drained. So that's important. And then keep it just moderately moist, and you will have a good head start on the season as well, using the caladiums year after year after year. You will be getting other tubers from this. You can do some division eventually. I usually do them in the spring and make sure that I don't overwater. Now with amaryllis we do a lot in the fall and towards Christmas. And I used to do tons of amaryllis because I did it a different way than most people. Amaryllis, once it's finished flowering, you cut the flower stalk down to about 6 inches above. Now it's going to probably leak sap or water, etc. Let it, don't worry about it, but you do want to make sure that that stem, the old flower stem, will eventually dry out. And as it dries out, becomes very, very brown, very brittle. You can pull it right out of the bulb. You can remove it. It's nice and clean. It's easy. During that time, though, you've probably got leaves developing, and this is good. This means that you can just put them in a window. They're already potted, so you're going to keep them just moist. It's a bulb. Give them a little bit of plant food. Keep that foliage going and encourage more. You don't really want the baby offsets, but, sometimes you get them. Some people remove them. Some people try and grow them on. But the problem is this. It takes years for them to get up into size to make it worth your while. It's not worth the effort. The bulb itself will get bigger and fuller, etc. Now, once frost is gone and the soil temperatures are up, and this is probably not in most cases until early June, you want to put them into full sun. And I mean full sun. Hot, dry, etc. And they're planted right into the ground. I have usually gone and gotten a bag of composted manure, put that in there, and sunk them into that, and still fed them with bulb foods or even some 20-20-20 on occasion, and really sort of force the bulbs. You have to understand that amaryllis is a tropical bulb. It really loves the warmth and the heat, and they're growing, basically, and finished off in warmer countries, and then after they've been sorted, cleaned, etc., they are then shipped into Holland and distributed throughout the world. With the amaryllis, remember when you're going to go repot it, you then have, if you're going to do the other method, okay, that method, what I've just described, it will bloom for you when it wants. It'll be a surprise. There's no timing to it. And as a result, you're going to get a pot in this week, next week, sometime there. So the more you have, the more you can bring them up into the home and have them blooming throughout the winter and early spring. If you're going to time them, then they're cut down completely, all foliage and everything, and they're stored in a cool place, no soil, etc., and they are allowed to just stay there. Now, if the bulb is just allow it to dry. I usually repot them. Make sure that the pot is only about an inch bigger than the bulb itself, maybe 2 if you're forced to. Bright light, full sun, full watering, not wet, and food. And the bulb that has had all that food in there from outside will actually bloom about 8 weeks later. So you can more time it. And that's what you do with the amaryllis. I'm Bruce Zimmerman, and this has been the Open Line Garden Show podcast for this week.